view, Pope Francis is doing something which has become seldom and which is very important in this call for the culture of encounters, which is to retrieve the very idea of humanity, of this important universal bound between all human beings on earth, as an idea to be pursued and defended and held up against different forms of particularism and of divisiveness. And the reason why I say that this call for a universal humanity and the defense of this idea has become a seldom appearance on the global arena, on the global stage, is because I see both on the right wing and on the left wing a tendency towards particularist solutions to our problems. So on the right, in the form of more and more nationalist sentiments that seek to isolate the nation from others. And on the left, as a consequence of a turn towards identity politics, which in my view has been very beneficial to generate progress for many groups, but that has also been accompanied by a sort of skepsis and distancing from the universal notion of humanity as the basis for our action onto the world. What I see as the essence of the culture of encounter is this condition of possibility, or the situation where it would become possible for a world where conflicting moral visions, conflicting universalisms are able to coexist and are respectful of one another, and where at the same time we don't give up acting towards our ideals and seeking to reduce inequality, eliminate prejudice and oppression, and minimize suffering in the world. In my own experience, I come from Brazil originally. In my time as a child and in my youth in Brazil, I feel that as a nation, we upheld an idea that we are all very pluralist, we are all very inclusive. Brazil is a nation of people of all colors who can live peacefully together and are happy with this mixture. And that was an illusion that served at the end of the day to mask the reality of very, very deep-seated racism and prejudice that structured and still continue in many ways to structure Brazilian society. And so what I think I have drawn from that experience is the realization that really only through action we can overcome this divisiveness that as Pope Francis says in his encyclical, ideas have to be coupled with concrete action in order for progress to be made towards a culture of encounter. So the culture of encounter cannot be a culture only in the sense of symbolic beliefs, but it must be reflected in real world policies, institutions, and actions as well. I can think of two examples, one very, very personal at the micro level of my personal experience, and the other one referring to political and social circumstances that I have also experienced and that are also part of my life. And the first very personal example is when I was, I think, 19 about. I went to live in Italy and lived with a family there in their home as a university student, exchange student. And this family turned out to be a family that held absolutely contrasting beliefs to my own. And we lived under the same roof for 1 year. And it was in many ways very, very difficult. This was a situation in which conflicting values had to be negotiated in order to live together, very literally, vivre ensemble. And we managed at a certain point, it seemed like it wasn't going to be possible and I was going to leave their home. But then afterwards, I found in my host a person that I respected very much because she was as enthusiastic about politics as I was, even though we were absolutely at the other extreme of the divide, the political divide. And so this idea that one has strong views that are worth fighting for, and that we think that the way to do so is through politics, was something that connected us and that enabled us to overcome the more specific differences that we had. So that was a very personal anecdote, but that I think has taught me a lot about the possibilities of really finding a common basis, even in situations where a lot is at stake and where it's very difficult to coexist, and even more than coexist, really live together. And that is kind of a parody that one could use for the whole of society, if you will, that and the divisiveness that we experience today. The political or societal example, the broader one that I can think of, where I was most impressed by the existence of a culture of encounter that was visible, palpable, was the so-called refugee crisis of 2015, when many immigrants, refugees, people seeking asylum, people fleeing persecution, destitution, oppression, violence, came from Syria and other parts of the world to Europe, partially by foot, along rail tracks, coming in trains, coming in by foot in all sorts of ways, many people arriving. And the response in the first moment, or during a certain period of time when people were coming, was that an impressive amount of people went out to these train stations, to these border places, holding signs saying refugees are welcome, offering clothes, offering their homes, volunteering to provide food, to provide shelter, to care for children in need. And that was a very impressive demonstration of social solidarity that I experienced here firsthand. And that was also coupled by political action when Angela Merkel declared famously, we can make it, wir schaffen das. This was also for me a demonstration of this kind of solidarity that I think should lie at the basis of such a culture of encounter. Now, what I have also learned from this example is that while it is possible to enact such a culture of encounter, of welcome, and of solidarity, and of love for the other, this is also a very, very tenuous situation. And what we have experienced since in Europe has been a backlash against this attitude that has been very detrimental to what I would consider a culture of encounter that's worth having and fighting for. In my work as a researcher, I'm investigating the actions of a movement, an international, transnational movement of solidarity with immigrants that's composed of religious actors, political actors, and civil society actors. And this is the movement that I call, using a term that's used by the people who are involved, the sanctuary movement, the international sanctuary movement. One example of this sanctuary movement are churches, both in the United States and in Europe, especially in Germany, that host asylum seekers, people who are at risk of deportation, families, in their premises, in the hopes that by doing so, they will shield these people from the danger of being deported into a country where they would be risking their lives. Another example are cities that declare themselves to be cities of sanctuary, to be welcoming cities for immigrants, and enact policies that are meant to protect people who are in vulnerable positions by being immigrants, and who, in doing so, also resist national level, federal level policies and politics that seek to demonize immigrants or to create walls and barriers for the integration of immigrants and refugees into host communities. And a third example would be groups that go to the border and seek to literally rescue those whose lives are at risk while trying to cross borders in order to claim asylum or to escape violence and oppression and suffering. And I'm looking into such groups who act in the Mediterranean, rescuing people who are at the risk of drowning and trying to cross from North Africa to Europe, and also groups in the United States in the desert region between Mexico and the United States, where also many lives are lost and a lot of suffering is incurred while trying to cross borders. These are groups very often composed of faith communities, churches, but not only, who are in a network with other civil society actors who are also endorsed and sometimes led, in the case of sanctuary cities, also by political actors. So it's a broad coalition, and it's also a transnational network. It's really a movement that is mobilizing this notion of solidarity and the notion of sanctuary and of something sacred that needs to be protected in the form of these human lives, and of the worth, and that the worth of each human life should be reflected in policies and actions of that protect and welcome migrants and refugees into our communities. That I think is a big inspiration for this idea of the culture of encounter. We can derive resources and inspiration from such movements and from the actors within them. I also think, if I may say one more sentence about this, that this is a very interesting form of mobilization because it cuts across common binaries and divisions that we tend to take for granted, such as the secular versus the religious, but also the progressive versus the conservative, because you have within this movement people who might be considered progressive on migration issues, but who are defenders of tradition, who are doing those who are acting in this way out of values that might be considered by others as conservative. religious communities acting on the basis of their beliefs. And you also have, as I mentioned, this network that cuts across religious denominations, that brings different religious denominations together, and also cuts across the secular religious divide, and introduces, and it's a moral form of political action, but not one as we would think of when we think of morality politics, of moral conflicts, of cultural conflicts that are also pervasive in our world today. The existing networks are also deployed to deal with new conflicts. For example, the group I am investigating on the border in Arizona that's seeking to create these sanctuaries on the border is led by somebody who was a key figure of the sanctuary movement in the 80s, of the churches that hosted people from Guatemala, El Salvador, John Fife, a minister who is now, who has then created this organization called No More Deaths in Arizona. So I think that we need to look at, of course, how things emerge, but there's also a kind of continuity in the sense that those who are mobilized in favor of solidarity are able to draw on previous existing resources, movements and ideas, and deploy them elsewhere as well.